Level 1, the first million. You don't feel it happen. There's no alarm, no notification banner announcing you've crossed a threshold most people spend their entire careers imagining. You check a brokerage app on an ordinary Tuesday, the way you've checked it hundreds of times before, and the number sitting at the bottom of the screen has crossed 7 figures for the first time. You don't call anyone, not because you're being strategic about it. At this level, silence isn't a decision yet. It's just the absence of an obvious reason to say anything. Telling someone would require explaining a number that still feels abstract even to you. Built slowly across years of automated contributions into index funds, nobody at a dinner party wants to hear described in detail. This is where the pattern actually starts, because the habit of not mentioning it forms before the number is even large enough to be interesting. By the time it becomes genuinely large, silence isn't a choice anymore. It's simply how you've always operated. Level 2, the quiet compounding years. Between 1 million and 10 million, almost nothing about your daily life changes, which is exactly the mechanism most people underestimate when they imagine what building this kind of wealth actually looks like. You don't quit your job. You don't buy anything that would require an explanation. The portfolio grows through a combination of continued contributions and market performance that, across a long enough timeline, does most of the heavy lifting without requiring any dramatic decision on your part. This is where the myth of sudden wealth breaks down completely. People imagine a single event, a stock pick, a lucky bet, a moment of obvious transformation. What actually happens at this level is closer to erosion in reverse, a boring, repetitive process compounding in the background while your visible life remains completely unremarkable. You still drive the same car. You still live in the same apartment. The only thing that's changed is a number on a screen that almost nobody else has ever seen because you've never once shown it to them. Level 3, the first real temptation to tell someone. Somewhere around 15 or 20 million, the portfolio crosses a threshold where the number stops feeling abstract and starts feeling like something worth acknowledging out loud, if only to confirm to yourself that it's actually real. This is the level where most people who eventually go quiet almost don't. There's a specific moment, a family dinner, a conversation with an old friend catching up after years apart, where the number sits right at the edge of your mouth, and telling them would be easy, almost natural, given the context of the conversation. You don't say it. Not because you've developed some elaborate philosophy about privacy yet. At this level, the silence is closer to instinct than strategy, a felt sense that saying the number out loud would change the conversation permanently, and you're not ready to find out how. This is the level where the habit calcifies. Once you've successfully resisted the urge to tell someone during a moment when telling them would have been genuinely easy, every future moment of temptation becomes easier to resist by comparison. Level 4, the market event that tests everything. Every portfolio eventually experiences a downturn severe enough to remove a meaningful percentage of its value in a short period, and how you respond to this event says more about your actual relationship with the money than any of the years of steady growth that preceded it. At this level, you watch several $1 million evaporate from the number over a period of weeks, sometimes days, and you don't sell. This isn't because you're immune to fear. It's because somewhere in the years of quiet compounding, you developed an actual, lived understanding of volatility instead of an abstract fear of it, the same way anyone who's watched a pattern repeat enough times stops treating each new instance as a unique crisis. The people who built wealth quickly through some single dramatic event almost always panic during this level because they never developed the specific emotional calibration that comes from watching the number move naturally in both directions, across enough time to recognize a dip as weather rather than catastrophe. You, by contrast, have seen this before. Smaller versions of the same pattern at lower dollar amounts, enough times that the current version registers as familiar rather than alarming. Level 5, the professional you eventually have to bring in. Somewhere past 25 or 30 million, managing everything yourself stops being realistic, not because you've become incapable, but because the tax complexity, the estate considerations, and the sheer administrative surface area of a portfolio this size genuinely exceed what one person can competently handle alone. This is where the first crack in total secrecy appears, because you now need at least one person, an accountant, a financial advisor, an estate attorney, who knows the actual number. This professional relationship operates under a completely different set of rules than every other relationship in your life. Confidentiality isn't a personal favor here. It's a legal and professional obligation backed by licensing requirements and liability exposure that make disclosure genuinely costly for the person holding your information. You choose this person carefully, not primarily for expertise, though that matters, but for a specific kind of discretion that becomes obvious within the first few meetings. Someone who treats the number as a technical detail to be managed rather than a fact worth discussing, someone whose own behavior around money signals they've handled numbers like yours before without treating it as remarkable. This is the level where you learn something important. Total secrecy was never actually possible past a certain scale. What's possible instead is a carefully limited circle, small enough to control, professional enough to be structurally reliable. Level 6, the specific lie you tell your closest people. Not a dramatic lie. A small, structural one, repeated so consistently it stops feeling like deception at all. You maintain a version of your financial life that's accurate in every detail except scale. You do have investments. You did make good decisions with index funds early on. You are doing well. Every individual statement is technically true. What's missing is the actual number, replaced with a vague gesture toward comfortable rather than the specific figure that would recontextualize every conversation you've ever had about money with these people. This is where the psychological cost of the secret becomes real for the first time, because maintaining this gap requires active management rather than passive omission. You have to remember which version of your finances you've presented to which person, calibrate your reactions to their financial stresses without revealing that you could solve most of them with a single transfer, and sit through conversations about their money anxieties while holding information that would fundamentally change the conversation if disclosed. The exhaustion here isn't about guilt exactly. It's closer to the specific fatigue of running two parallel realities simultaneously, one for the world and one for yourself, and needing to keep track of which reality applies in which room. Level 7, the moment you almost break the pattern completely. There's always a specific moment, usually tied to someone else's financial hardship, where the temptation to simply solve the problem with money you clearly have becomes almost unbearable. A parent facing a medical bill, a sibling struggling with a mortgage, a close friend quietly panicking about a job loss while you sit across the table with the actual, uncomplicated ability to make the entire crisis disappear. At this level, you don't reveal the number, but you do start finding indirect ways to help, structured specifically to avoid explanation. A payment routed through a system designed to look like insurance covering more than expected. An unexpected gift positioned as a modest windfall rather than what it actually represents. A loan forgiven quietly, framed as something that was never really expected to be repaid in the first place. This is where you develop a specific skill that nobody teaches directly, the ability to be genuinely generous while remaining completely opaque about the actual scale of what you're capable of giving. Enough to help. Never enough to explain where the help is actually coming from. Level 8, the identity question that arrives uninvited. Somewhere past 50 million, usually during an ordinary week with nothing particularly dramatic happening, a specific realization arrives that most people who reach this level describe almost identically. As long as nobody knows the real number, you get to remain in everyone's eyes exactly who you were before any of this happened. The same person who calls for advice, the same person who gets asked if they're eating properly, the same person whose life apparently looks unremarkable from the outside because you've made sure it does. The moment the number becomes known, that version of you disappears permanently, replaced by something else in the eyes of everyone who learns it. Successful, certainly, but also separate, occupying a category that removes you from the ordinary texture of relationships you've spent your entire life building. This is where you understand something uncomfortable. The secret was never really about protecting other people from the complications of knowing. It was about protecting your own ability to remain unchanged in the eyes of the people who knew you before any of this was true. Level 9, the estate problem nobody solves cleanly. Eventually, the money has to go somewhere, and unlike every other level in this progression, this one cannot be solved through continued silence. Wills require disclosure. Estate planning requires naming beneficiaries who will, at some point, learn the actual scale of what they're receiving. Trust structures can delay the reveal, sometimes for years, sometimes until after your death, but they cannot prevent it indefinitely. This is where the entire architecture of secrecy meets its structural limit. You can control who knows during your lifetime with remarkable precision. You cannot control what happens to that information once you're no longer the one managing it. Some people at this level begin a slow, deliberate process of partial disclosure, revealing pieces of the picture incrementally over years, allowing the people closest to them to adjust gradually rather than confronting the entire scale at once. Others choose full concealment until the end, accepting that the reveal, whenever it eventually happens, will happen without them present to manage the reaction. Neither approach fully resolves the tension. The secret that protected you throughout your life becomes, at this level, a problem you're handing to someone else to manage after you're gone. Level 10, what actually connects every level. Across every stage described here, from the first quiet million to the eventual estate question nobody solves cleanly, the same underlying pattern holds. Silence isn't a single decision made once. It's a structure maintained continuously, level by level, each stage requiring slightly more active management than the one before it, until what started as simple omission becomes an entire architecture of controlled disclosure, limited circles, and carefully maintained gaps between what's true and what's known. The people who successfully maintain this kind of secrecy across decades aren't unusually skilled at deception. They've simply made a series of consistent, low drama choices at each level, resisting the specific moment of temptation that level presented until the accumulated weight of those choices became a habit indistinguishable from personality. What the money actually buys at every level was never really lifestyle. It was optionality, held quietly, available but rarely exercised, sitting behind an ordinary life that looks, from every visible angle, exactly like everyone else's. The number was never the hard part. Keeping it invisible, level after level, year after year, without a single unplanned disclosure, that was always the real project. If this changed how you think about what actually happens after the number stops feeling real, drop the next topic you want broken down in the comments.